Just a nurse. That's what they called her in the hallway at St. Michael's, whispered between clipboards and pharmaceutical representatives clogging the break room with donuts. Just a nurse. Grey hair pulled back in a plain bun. Orthopedic shoes squeaking on linoleum. Reading glasses on a beaded chain. They didn't see the surgical scars on her hands, the way the fluorescent light caught the thin white lines webbing her knuckles like maps of places she'd never speak about. They didn't see the way she moved through doorways, eyes checking corners first, a habit so old it had calcified into muscle memory. They didn't know that the woman they'd hired 3 years ago to push vitals charts and empty bedpans was Captain Margaret Walsh, Defense Intelligence Agency, call sign Valkyrie, whispered only in classified field hospital tents across Kandahar where she'd operated under gunfire with steadier hands than most surgeons had in operating rooms. St. Michael's geriatric wing smelled like antiseptic and overcooked vegetables, that particular hospital blend that no amount of air freshener could mask. The fluorescent lights hummed their constant electronic prayer above hallways lined with rooms where people came to fade slowly or sometimes quickly, and Margaret had learned long ago not to distinguish between the two. She'd seen faster finishes on combat stretchers. She'd seen slower ones in these beds. The wing was quiet this morning, the kind of pre-dawn silence that made the ventilators and heart monitors sound like a mechanical orchestra tuning up before the real performance began. Rain hammered the parking lot outside her assigned unit, audible through the reinforced windows, a percussion section underlining everything that was about to happen and everything Margaret had driven to Raleigh to watch. She arrived 30 minutes early, the way she arrived every morning, changing into her scrubs in the locker room that smelled of stale coffee and the industrial detergent the housekeeping department had been using for 6 months, despite at least 4 nurses filing complaints about the chemical burns it left on hands. The locker room was empty at 6:17 a.m. Margaret sat on the bench in front of her assigned space, opening the door to reveal her single personal item, a folded American flag, the kind that came in a wooden case, this one missing its case. She'd carried it from Kandahar to Walter Reed to 3 different civilian hospitals before landing here at St. Michael's. Every morning, she touched it. Just once. The fabric had worn soft from handling, from the kind of ceremony grief teaches you when it's 2 in the morning and you can't sleep and your hands need to remember what they held. The flag bore a name. Not Margaret's. She'd never speak it aloud in this building. Her hands trembled sometimes when she was alone with it, but not the kind of trembling the style guides talked about, not fear. Restraint. The trembling of a woman holding a container that held too much. She folded her own scrubs with military precision, the creases sharp enough to cut paper, and tied back her hair with the same bun she'd maintained for 3 years. The grey at her temples was natural now. The soft voice she'd practiced for 18 months was no longer a practiced thing. The glasses she wore were prescription, not costume. Margaret had learned that the best disguises are the ones that become true over time. She wasn't playing an unremarkable geriatric nurse. She was an unremarkable geriatric nurse. She just happened to be a captain underneath. By 6:51 a.m., she was at the nursing station reviewing the morning admissions. 2 new patients arriving in the next hour. One was routine, Catherine Mullins, 84, hip replacement recovery transfer. The other had a code that made Margaret's breath come shallow and controlled. Commander James Reeves, Coast Guard. Age 41. Admitted from Mercy General, transferred for extended rehabilitation and observation following catastrophic injuries sustained in Kandahar. The report was sparse, the kind of sparse that meant classified, but Margaret could read between lines that had been deliberately redacted. Shrapnel from an IED. Partial chest wall compromise. Injuries that didn't quite explain why a combat officer was being transferred to a geriatric rehabilitation center in Raleigh when Walter Reed had entire wings dedicated to exactly this kind of case. Margaret read his full chart 3 times before the shift supervisor arrived. He was 28 months post-injury. He'd been through 17 separate surgical reconstructions. His knowledge of Coast Guard operations in Kandahar had made him a high-value target for the kind of intelligence agencies that thought about such things, and one of those agencies had called Margaret on a Tuesday morning in April 3 years ago and given her a name and a city and a role and told her to become invisible until further notice. You're assigned to Reeves, the shift supervisor said, pulling Margaret from the chart like a submarine surfacing. 4th bed, East Wing. He's arriving at 7. Needs full neuro checks every 2 hours. Pain management is light, he requests minimal medication. And Margaret. The supervisor was already moving past her toward the coffee station. He's got family history with military service. Just be gentle. There's trauma there that a chart won't show you. Margaret nodded, not trusting her voice to stay soft. Gentle. The word sat in her chest like a stone in a riverbed, smooth from being turned over so many times. She'd been gentle with a 19-year-old private from Iowa who'd lost his legs below the knee and was trying not to cry in front of his mother. She'd been gentle with a Marine sergeant who'd taken shrapnel to the face and was learning that gentle meant meeting him where his fear lived instead of trying to talk him out of it. Gentle was a skill. Gentle was a choice. Gentle was what you did when the only power you had left was the permission to hold someone's hand while they hurt. She prepared the room with the kind of attention that would look like care and was actually operational precision. For hook on the wall at the precise angle that meant easy access but not threatening visibility. Pain medication cart positioned 2 steps from the bed. Monitors calibrated to trigger alarms at specific thresholds. The room became a controlled space, which was Margaret's favorite kind of space, which was the only kind of space she'd worked in for the past 23 years, whether the walls were canvas or concrete or drywall that smelled faintly of new paint. At 6:58 a.m., her phone buzzed inside her locker. She didn't retrieve it. The text would be from her handler, a man she'd never met in person, communicating through channels that technically didn't exist. The message was simple protocol, subject arrives 7 o'clock. Establish baseline. Report vitals every 6 hours until further notice. Margaret had already established baseline. She'd been establishing baseline for 3 years, watching the physical therapy logs, the dietary intake records, the medication adjustments that trickled through the patient database like water finding cracks. She'd been watching Commander Reeves the way a sniper watches a checkpoint, patient and still and waiting for the moment everything changes. The moment started at 7:04 a.m. when the ambulance bay doors opened with a hydraulic hiss and orderlies wheeled a man into the East Wing who looked like he'd been rebuilt from parts that didn't quite match. Tall. Blonde hair going silver. Jaw that could cut glass. But scarred in a way that went deeper than skin. The scars on his face told a story the medical chart couldn't capture, but Margaret had learned to read scars the way other people read novels. This one said, "Pain is data. Pain is information. I will survive this and I will not pretend it didn't happen." She watched from the nursing station as they transferred him to the bed, his movements controlled and measured, a man who'd learned to live inside his own geometry, accounting for damage the way an engineer accounts for structural compromise. The orderlies left at 7:12. The supervising nurse checked vitals at 7:15. And at 7:18, Margaret approached the bed with her medication cart and her soft voice and her invisible hands, and Commander Reeves opened his eyes and looked at her the way a man looks at something he's almost certain isn't real. "Morning vitals," she said, her voice exactly at the register she'd maintained for 36 months. "Just going to get a baseline." "You're doing fine." He nodded, watching her work. His eyes were blue like a winter sky over the Hindu Kush, and they tracked her movements with the precision of a man trained to process threat assessments. The vitals came back clean. Blood pressure stable. Heart rhythm steady. Oxygen saturation exactly where it should be. She charted everything in the patient record with the kind of detail that would later make people uncomfortable, writing with the precision of a woman documenting evidence that someone had been here, had been alive, had mattered enough to track with numbers. "First time at St. Michael's?" he asked. His voice was low, a tank idling in a garage, that rumble that carries weight. "I've been here 3 years," she said. "You're my new focus." Something flickered in his eyes then. Some recognition that made the skin on her neck tighten. But she was already turning, already moving, already becoming invisible again, just a nurse with grey hair and squeaking shoes, documenting the existence of a man who didn't know that someone had been waiting for him to arrive exactly like this, exactly now, exactly at the moment when everything was about to change and neither of them could stop it. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part arrived at 8:16 a.m., moving through the hallway like a storm system, and his name was Dr. Pierce. Dr. Pierce moved through the hallway like a storm system, his white coat trailing behind him, and he arrived at Commander Reeves' room at 8:56 a.m. with the kind of timing that suggested he'd been waiting for an audience. The commander's sister sat in the vinyl chair beside the bed, her purse clutched in her lap. His nephew leaned against the doorframe, still in his Navy dress uniform, a petty officer second class, judging by the rating badge. Perfect. Witnesses. That was exactly what Pierce needed. He didn't knock. He entered like he owned the room, which, in his mind, he did. Every room in St. Michael's belonged to him, had for 6 years, ever since he'd established himself as the facility's most prolific billing generator, the one who could turn a routine evaluation into a cascade of procedures, each one a revenue stream, each one documented in the charts with the precision of a man who'd learned that paper trails were safer than handshake deals. "Ah, Commander," Pierce said, his voice pitched loud enough to carry into the hallway, "I see we have family visiting." "Wonderful. I need to discuss some concerns about your care." Margaret was checking me for line, her hands moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd performed the same task 300 times before. She didn't look up. The fluorescent overhead light cast everything in a pale institutional glow, and she existed in that light like she was part of the building itself, unremarkable, expected, barely visible. "Nurse Walsh," Pierce continued, and she heard the smile in his voice, the kind of smile that comes right before the knife goes in, "I need to discuss your concerning charting habits. You've been questioning treatment protocols established by physicians with actual medical degrees." He paused, letting that land. "It's concerning." The commander's sister made a small sound, something between a gasp and a question. Margaret's jaw tightened, but her hands didn't slow. The 4 was running at the correct rate, 50 milliliters per hour, perfectly calibrated for a man with Reeves' cardiac history. She'd checked it 6 times in the past 3 hours. Not because the protocol required it, but because she'd been trained to notice when things were wrong, and her instincts, honed across 15 years of field work, had started firing the moment Pierce's name appeared on Reeves' care team. "Your outdated methods," Pierce said, turning slightly toward the family as if to include them in his observation, as if they were all reasonable people observing a problem together, "are bordering on malpractice. Perhaps geriatric care is too complex for someone with your limited training." There it was. The insult delivered like a diagnosis. The nephew's face flushed. The sister's hands gripped the purse tighter. Margaret finished adjusting the 4, stepped back, and turned to face him. Her eyes were 2 grey stones in a perfectly neutral face. No trembling. No voice crack. No retreat. Just a flat, cold stare that could have frozen the blood in a man's veins, and would have if Pierce had possessed any capacity for self-reflection, which he did not. "Don't worry," Pierce said, addressing the family now, completely, "we'll assign someone more qualified to oversee your brother's care. Someone with proper credentials." He smiled. A wolf showing its teeth. "Nurse Walsh, perhaps you should consider whether this position is still suitable for your skill level." The commander had been awake the entire time, his dark eyes tracking every word, every movement. A man who'd served 14 years in the Coast Guard didn't sleep through conversations about his care. A man who'd been in Kandahar, who'd seen things that would make most people's hands shake forever, knew exactly what was happening. This was a power play. This was a man establishing dominance in front of an audience. Margaret waited until Pierce finished speaking. Until his last word hung in the air like a challenge. Then she spoke, her voice perfectly level, carrying the kind of calm that comes from absolute certainty about what needs to happen next. "Strange how your prescribed escalations only happen to patients with the best insurance." The room went silent. Not a quiet moment. A silence so complete it felt like the world had paused mid-breath. Pierce's face went pale, then red, a flush spreading up from his collar like he'd been physically struck. The sister's eyes widened. The nephew stopped breathing. Margaret turned and walked away. Not quickly. Not dramatically. She simply turned and moved toward the door with the kind of steady, unhurried pace that comes from someone who knows exactly where they're going and doesn't require permission to get there. Her anger didn't radiate like heat, it radiated like frost, a cold so absolute it seemed to lower the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. Pierce tried to speak, but nothing came out. By the time he found his voice again, she was already gone, her footsteps silent on the tile, her presence evaporating like she'd never been there at all. She went to the break room at noon. The fluorescent panels overhead hummed their electronic song, and the microwave smelled like someone had heated fish 3 hours ago, a scent that clung to the air with the persistence of a bad memory. Margaret sat at the table with her lunch, a container of grilled chicken and brown rice, methodically calm. Fork. Rice. Chicken. Repeat. For nurses were already in the room. She recognized them all. Stephanie, who'd borrowed her compression socks last month. Jennifer, who'd asked Margaret for advice about her mother's medication interactions. Laura, who'd sat next to her at the hospital picnic in June and actually asked her questions about her life, or tried to, before Margaret had redirected the conversation with the precision of someone who'd spent a career giving nothing away. When Margaret sat down, Stephanie stood up. The motion was smooth, practiced, the kind of stand-up that wasn't fleeing but a coordinated exit. Jennifer followed. Then the two newer nurses, whose names Margaret had never bothered to learn because she'd known they wouldn't be here long. Their chairs scraped against the linoleum, a sound like small protests, like the room itself was objecting to what was about to happen. Laura hesitated. She actually looked at Margaret, her face caught between loyalty and self-preservation, which was its own kind of honest. "Sorry," she whispered, the word barely audible, and then she left too. Margaret ate alone in the break room, surrounded by the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a television from the waiting room. Her hands were perfectly steady. Her face was expressionless. She finished half her lunch, then sealed the container and placed it back in the refrigerator behind the expired yogurt that would stay there for another 3 weeks before someone finally threw it away. By Friday, the formal write-up appeared on the unit's public board in the nursing station, the place where all staff passed at least twice a shift, where medication schedules and patient updates and departmental notices lived in orderly rows, where your professional failures became communal knowledge. Nurse M. Walsh, it read, printed on official St. Michael's letterhead, Pierce's signature at the bottom in the kind of careful handwriting that came from someone who understood signatures could become evidence. Written warning, failure to follow prescribed treatment escalations. Your recent charting indicates resistance to recommended cardiac workup protocols despite clear clinical indicators. This represents a deviation from hospital policy 4.2.1 regarding treatment standard adherence. Remedial training required. Repeat violations may result in disciplinary action up to and including termination. 6 unnecessary cardiac workups. That's what Margaret saw when she read the official terminology. 6 procedures that Commander Reeves didn't need, that would generate somewhere in the neighborhood of $30,000 in billing codes, that represented exactly the pattern she'd been documenting for 3 weeks now. A small cluster of nurses had gathered around the notice when she approached. They scattered like birds, conversation stopping mid-sentence, eyes suddenly very interested in the medication cart and the supply cabinet and literally anywhere else. Margaret read the notice once, her jaw tight, her eyes moving across each word with the kind of deliberate attention someone pays when they're committing something to memory. Which she was. Every word. Every implication. She stood there for 11 seconds. Long enough for the silence to become meaningful. Long enough for everyone watching to understand that this moment mattered. Then she turned and walked away without making a sound, her anger radiating like frost, like something so cold it could damage whatever it touched, and the nurses who'd been watching quickly looked away and pretended they'd never seen her face at all. In the medication room, with the door locked and the lights dim to save her eyes, Margaret pulled Commander Reeves' chart from the electronic system and began her real work. The work that had nothing to do with the write-up or the humiliation or the calculated campaign Pierce had launched to destroy her credibility. She'd survived worse. She would survive this. The Medicare billing codes for Reeves' 6 cardiac workups in the past 8 weeks told a story that didn't match the clinical reality documented in the actual medical record. According to Pierce's documented justifications, the commander had shown declining cardiac function, elevated troponin markers, and concerning EKG changes that required immediate intervention. According to Margaret's charts, the one she'd written based on actual vital signs and actual lab results and actual physical examinations, Commander Reeves' cardiac function was stable, his troponin levels were normal, and his EKG showed no acute changes. One of them was lying. Margaret knew who. She photographed 3 pages with her personal phone, the flash brief in the darkened room, and slipped the device back into her pocket. The photos were insurance. Not for her, she had no insurance, not anymore, not since she'd volunteered for the assignment that had brought her to St. Michael's 3 years ago. No next of kin listed, no emergency contacts, no social media presence that could connect her to anyone or anything. Insurance for the mission. Insurance for Commander Reeves. Dr. Pierce sat in his office at 4:15 p.m., after the administrative staff had left, when the hallway outside his door had gone quiet and the only sounds were the hum of his computer and the rain beginning to tap against the windows. He pulled Margaret Walsh's personnel file from his drawer, something he'd been meaning to do all day, something that had finally become necessary, and opened it with the kind of careful attention a man pays when he's about to change someone's life. 3 years of employment. Unremarkable evaluation scores. No complaints for the first 2 years. Then, recently, questions about treatment protocols that hadn't been asked before. Observations about billing that had no business being in a nurse's clinical notes. Attention to detail that was starting to look less like competence and more like deliberate scrutiny. He picked up the phone and dialed a number that connected him directly to a compliance officer named Devereaux, a woman who'd been on his payroll for 4 years and had developed a useful talent for finding documentation that supported whatever narrative Pierce needed supported. "I need everything," Pierce said quietly into the phone. "Background check, previous employment, family ties, financial records. I need to understand who Margaret Walsh is, and I need to understand why she's been questioning my treatment decisions." "How soon?" Devereaux asked. "Yesterday," Pierce said. "And Devereaux?" "I want grounds for immediate termination. Real grounds. The kind that won't hold up to a lawsuit, but the kind that will be in her permanent record either way." He hung up and leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of control settling back into place. She'd made a mistake when she'd challenged him in front of witnesses. She'd made another mistake when she'd questioned his protocols. And she'd made her biggest mistake when she'd implied that his treatment decisions were anything other than medically sound. By Monday, Margaret had decided she would need to file a formal complaint with the Hospital Ethics Board. By Tuesday, she realized she couldn't, not without revealing the DIA credentials she didn't officially possess and jeopardizing the mission. By Wednesday, she understood that Pierce had already won. The medication room at St. Michael's smelled like antiseptic and plastic bottles, the fluorescent overhead casting everything in a sickly white glow. Margaret pulled Commander Reeves' chart from the locked cabinet, her movements methodical and precise, each gesture economical. 3 years. She'd been watching this man for 3 years, documenting his recovery from injuries that should have killed him, injuries sustained in Kandahar when an IED detonated 3 meters from his position during a routine patrol near the Sanjin Valley. The classified briefing had called him a high-value asset. What she read in his medical file called him Dr. Pierce's personal profit center. She spread the papers across the laminate counter, her finger tracing the discrepancies. Medicare billing code 99235 for an extended evaluation and management visit, billed at the highest complexity level, marked as medically necessary. But Margaret's own charting from that same date told a different story. Vital signs stable. Pain controlled. Wound healing within expected parameters. No complications. No justification for the code. She photographed it with the burner phone hidden in her scrub pocket, the camera shutter silent. 1, 2, 3 frames. The pattern emerged like a constellation she couldn't unsee. Elderly patients populated the Medicare rolls. Elderly patients with excellent insurance coverage. Mr. Harrison in 412 billed for daily physical therapy escalation, but Margaret's notes showed he'd refused participation. Mrs. Chen in 508 coded for twice daily wound care, but Margaret had performed once daily dressing changes that never showed signs of complication. Mr. Valdez, a cascade of diagnostic imaging that yielded nothing. No findings. No follow-up needed. Yet the billing codes told a story of urgent, escalating medical need. Pierce's story. A story that generated approximately $847,000 in unnecessary procedures across just the geriatric ward in the past 18 months. She photographed each discrepancy. Her hands were steady. This was data. Pain is data. Fraud is data. Her job was to document it, not yet to act. That would come later, after she confirmed the pattern stretched beyond these 3 cases, after she mapped the full scope of the scheme, after she understood exactly what she was uncovering. But the edges of her jaw tightened slightly as she catalogued each one. By Thursday morning, Dr. Pierce knew. He found her in the medication room again, this time with a thick folder clutched against his chest like a shield. His face carried the particular expression of a man who'd learned something that made him dangerous, not violent, but calculated. His eyes were the color of a winter sky just before a storm. He closed the door behind him with the soft precision of someone ensuring privacy for a difficult conversation. "Your charting habits are remarkable," he said. His voice didn't rise. That was worse than shouting. Meticulous. Thorough. Obsessive, really. Do you review every physician's treatment protocols with that same level of scrutiny? Margaret didn't answer. Answers were traps. She continued organizing the medication vials, her movements unchanged, her breathing unchanged. She'd trained for this, the moment when exposure arrived, wearing a suit and carrying a file. "I've reviewed your notes for the past 37 days, Pierce continued, opening the folder. "You've questioned my care escalations on 14 separate occasions. Questioned them in front of patients. In front of families. Yesterday you told Mrs. Chen that her imaging was likely unnecessary, and I quote directly from Nurse Rodriguez's incident statement." He pulled out a sheet. "That creates a hostile environment toward the medical director. It undermines patient trust in my clinical judgment. It's also a violation of policy for point 2.1. Margaret's hand stilled for exactly 1 second. Not trembling. Not frozen. A technical pause. The document was already prepared. The statements from Rodriguez and another nurse, both of whom received staff bonuses tied to Pierce's referral network, were already signed. The bureaucratic machinery was already in motion. "You'll be placed on a performance improvement plan, effective immediately," Pierce said, handing her a fresh packet that felt impossibly heavy for paper. "Every medication you administer will be documented in triplicate. Every decision you make regarding patient care will be submitted for my review within 4 hours. Every interaction with physicians will be reported. This will continue for 60 days. At that time, we'll determine whether you're fit to continue employment here." Margaret took the packet. Her fingers didn't shake. Her eyes didn't waver. When she finally spoke, her voice had dropped an octave, a shift so subtle that only someone trained to hear it would notice the transformation. "My charting reflects clinical reality. I document what I observe." "You document what you want me to explain," Pierce corrected. His smile was thin, razor-edged. "You question treatment decisions in front of patients. That's insubordination. I can document that as incident number 47 in your permanent file if you'd like to continue arguing about clinical judgment." He turned toward the door, then paused. "Also, you're reassigned. Laura will take Commander Reeves' care. You'll manage the dementia ward. I need someone questioning my decisions to be nowhere near patients I'm actively treating." The words landed like shrapnel. Separation from Reeves meant separation from her mission. 3 years of proximity, of monitoring, of subtle protection, severed by a bureaucratic decision that would look perfectly reasonable on paper. A physician's prerogative. A necessary staffing adjustment. No violation of protocol. Commander Reeves' injuries are significant, Margaret said quietly. Continuity of care is medically indicated for. Are you questioning my patient assignment? Pierce interrupted, his voice carrying the precise tone of someone documenting insubordination in real time. That's a second violation. I can add it to the file now, or you can stop talking and accept the reassignment. He waited exactly 3 seconds. What's it going to be, Nurse Walsh? Margaret set the performance improvement plan folder on the counter with the same care she'd used placing an explosive charge. Understood. Good. Pierce opened the door. The dementia ward is short-staffed. You'll be needed immediately. I'll expect your first documented care decisions by tonight. He left without waiting for acknowledgement, his shoes clicking against the tile with the rhythm of a man who'd just won something. The medication room was silent except for the electrical hum of the refrigerator. Margaret stood motionless, her eyes fixed on the empty space where Pierce had been. Her mind was already working, already calculating, already assessing the information he'd revealed about his own vulnerability. He'd filed statements from staff members. That meant he'd coordinated with them. That meant they were invested in his success. That meant they would provide corroborating testimony when the moment came. The performance improvement plan was designed to appear thorough while actually accelerating her termination. 60 days to prove fitness. 60 days during which she'd be monitored, during which every decision would be scrutinized, during which the goalposts would shift incrementally toward failure. He'd constructed a paper trail so meticulous that her firing would look inevitable rather than vindictive. This was the real weapon. Not yelling. Not confrontation. Bureaucracy weaponized by a man smart enough to understand that documentation destroyed careers more effectively than anger ever could. That evening, Margaret sat in the staff parking lot in her Camry, engine off, watching the 4th-floor windows where Commander Reeves lay in recovery. She could see the outline of his figure against the curtain, could see Laura, a nurse Pierce had already corralled, checking his monitors. From this distance, she couldn't protect him. From this distance, she could only watch while another person's hands managed his care, potentially missing the subtleties of his condition, the particular way his left shoulder tensed when pain levels climbed, the micro-expressions that preceded deterioration in his neurological status. Her phone buzzed. An encrypted message from the Pentagon. 1 sentence, status update. When? She stared at the words. She couldn't report what she'd discovered without explaining how she'd discovered it, which meant revealing her presence, her method, her access to classified patient files. Reporting the fraud meant opening an investigation that would inevitably trace back to her, that would expose her charting methods, that would eventually lead to discovery of her true mission designation. The file would be her priority. The fraud would go unreported. The patients would continue to receive unnecessary procedures. Pierce would continue to profit. The rain started suddenly, hammering the windshield like applause for someone else's victory. Margaret watched it cascade down the glass, distorting the view of the hospital building, reducing it to smeared lights and shadows. She understood the trap now. Perfectly constructed. Perfectly legal. A man didn't have to be violent to be dangerous. He just had to be patient. He just had to understand that sometimes the most effective weapon wasn't a blade or a bullet. Sometimes it was simply time, and documentation, and the steady erasure of someone's ability to act. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Laura, competent, friendly Laura, would miss the signs that Margaret would have caught. The worst part was that in 60 days, when Margaret's termination became official, she wouldn't be there to catch the next deterioration. The worst part was that Pierce had somehow understood that the greatest threat to his operation wasn't exposure. It was her continued presence. He hadn't known the exact nature of her mission, but he'd intuited something, that she was dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with her nursing license, and everything to do with her ability to see through deception. So he'd removed her from the board entirely. Not by force. By policy. Margaret photographed the performance improvement plan document with her burner phone, then deleted the encrypted message without responding. She would need a different strategy now. She would need to think 3 moves ahead while appearing to comply with 2. She would need to become invisible again, not through deference, but through perfect adherence to the rules that were designed to destroy her. The rain continued. Inside St. Michael's, alarms beeped in measured patterns. Somewhere on the 4th floor, Commander Reeves slept under someone else's watch, while Margaret sat in the darkness, calculating how much time she had left before the machinery of his betrayal became irreversible. Tuesday morning at 7:36 a.m., the monitors showed nothing unusual. Commander Reeves sat propped on his side while Laura, the day shift nurse, checked his surgical wound from the Kandahar transfer for weeks prior. The scar tissue had healed well, or so everyone believed. Margaret stood at the nursing station 3 rooms away, reviewing vitals, when she heard Laura's voice change pitch. Not quite panic. Not yet. Just the small crack that comes when something shifts wrong beneath the surface. Margaret was moving before her conscious mind caught up. 23 years of muscle memory doesn't wait for permission. The crash cart was already rolling. Laura stood frozen beside the bed, her hands hovering uselessly as blood, dark arterial blood, the wrong kind, spread across Commander Reeves' gown like spilled wine. His chest wound had reopened. The old scar tissue had torn. Catastrophically. His pressure monitor beeped its descent, 92. 87, 81. Dr. Pierce rushed in, his face already flushed with the particular brand of panic that comes when a doctor realizes he's about to lose control of a room. His hands moved toward the wound, then stopped. Moved again. Stopped. The hesitation of someone trained in theory but not in the kind of bleeding that doesn't wait for procedure. He grabbed the wall phone, his voice shaking as he paged cardiothoracic, emergency consult, 4th floor, stat. Arterial hemorrhage, post-operative wound complication. His fingers fumbled with the phone receiver. Blood pressure, 75. 68, 62. Margaret didn't speak. She moved past Pierce like water around a stone, her eyes locked on Reeves' chest. The scalpel from the crash cart was in her hand before she'd consciously decided to reach for it. The blade caught the overhead light, a single bright flash, and then she was making the incision, the thoracotomy cut, her hands moving with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd done this in desert tents with mortars screaming overhead and no anesthesia except adrenaline and necessity. "You're not authorized to," Pierce's voice cracked like a boy's. Margaret cut him off with a single word, "clear." She reached into Reeves' chest cavity, her fingers finding the hemorrhaging vessel through layers of tissue and blood, and began manual compression, thumb and forefinger applying pressure exactly where it would stanch the arterial bleed without rupturing what remained of his lung. The blood covered her hands, her wrists, soaked through her scrubs. But her jaw didn't clench. Her breathing didn't change. This was data. Pain was data. Blood was data. And data could be managed. 12 minutes. That's how long she held him like that while Pierce backed against the wall, his face the color of old hospital tile. The intercom crackled with overhead pages, meaningless sound, white noise around the only thing that mattered, the steady compression of her fingers, the vessel holding, Reeves' pressure stabilizing at 85, climbing slowly to 91. The surgical team would arrive in minutes. They would take over. They would save what she'd kept from spilling across the floor. Reeves' eyes opened once, unfocused and distant. For half a second his gaze found hers. Recognition flickered, not of her face, but of something deeper. The quality of hands that knew exactly what they were doing. The presence of someone who had held worse things together in worse places. Then the anesthesia pulled him back under. The surgical team arrived at exactly minute 11. 2 surgeons and a trauma fellow, moving with the choreographed efficiency of people who'd done this before. Margaret stepped back without being asked, her hands and arms painted red to the elbows, and handed them the cavity like she was passing a relay baton. The fellow didn't even ask questions. He just nodded once, the nod of professional to professional, and took over the compression while the lead surgeon prepped for proper closure. "Excellent field work," the surgeon said, not looking at her. "How long?" 11 minutes, 40 seconds. He nodded again. That was all. She was already moving toward the door, already peeling off her contaminated gloves, when she heard Pierce's voice behind her, thin and trying to sound authoritative. "We'll need a full incident report on that unauthorized procedure." Margaret didn't turn around. She simply kept walking, her hands held away from her body like a surgeon leaving the OR, the red of Reeves' blood beginning to dry on her skin in the cool hallway air. 2 hours later, the incident report was already drafted. Dr. Pierce had wasted no time. Margaret found it in her mailbox at the nursing station, a single sheet printed on official hospital letterhead, her name at the top in that particular font reserved for formal accusations. Policy 7.23.4 Non-physicians are strictly prohibited from performing surgical incisions under any circumstances, including emergencies. The document was meticulous. Surgical. Each sentence designed to cut in a specific direction. The witness statements were already attached. 3 of them. All from nurses who'd been in the room during the code. All of them worked the same shifts that Pierce controlled with promises of better assignments and shift bonuses. Their words were careful, clinical. Ms. Walsh performed an incision without authorization. Dr. Pierce appeared to have the situation under control. The unauthorized procedure created confusion and delayed proper protocol response. The last sentence was particularly elegant in its dishonesty. Protocol had not existed. Protocol would have meant watching Reeves die while waiting for cardiothoracic. By Thursday, the formal termination recommendation had landed on the hospital board's desk. Pierce had submitted it himself, his voice in the email smooth as silk, while Captain Walsh's actions came from a place of good intention. Her violation of Policy 7.23.4 represents a liability that this institution cannot afford. I recommend immediate termination and reporting to the State Board of Nursing for license review. The email was copied to Risk Management, to the Chief Medical Officer, to the hospital's legal team. A paper trail so meticulous it looked like art. Margaret received her termination letter on Friday afternoon. She read it once, standing at the nursing station in front of 3 other nurses who suddenly became very interested in their computers. The letter was signed by the hospital board's executive director, a man whose name she'd seen twice in her 3 years at St. Michael's. His signature was expensive-looking, printed by a machine. Below his name, effective immediately. All access credentials will be deactivated. Final paycheck will be mailed within 7 business days. She folded it once, placing it back in the envelope with the same precision she'd once used to fold the flag of her fallen teammate, each crease deliberate, perfect, a final indignity. 3 days of walking through her apartment in silence. 3 days of watching the rain hammer against the windows in a pattern that sounded like applause for something she couldn't celebrate. And then, because she was a soldier first and a nurse second, she went to the hospital laundry room on Sunday night when no one else was there. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, that particular hospital hum that gets into your teeth. Margaret stood at the industrial folding table, her scrubs in a pile in front of her, the blue ones with the small stain on the left pocket from where she'd caught a patient's for line, the green ones from the morning she'd held Reeves' chest open, the white one she'd worn on her first day 3 years ago. She folded each one with the same care she'd used on that flag, the same perfect creases, each one a boundary between what she'd been and what she was about to become. The tears came quietly. Not sobs. Not the dramatic breakdown of someone in a movie. Just the simple biological fact of her body releasing what her mind had held too long. She didn't wipe them away. She just let them fall while her hands kept folding, kept creasing, kept performing the muscle memory of ritual. When the scrubs were stacked, when the table was clear, Margaret left them there. She didn't put them back in her locker. She just walked out of the laundry room, her shoes squeaking against the tile, and toward whatever came next. The thing about rock bottom is that it looks exactly like you'd expect it to look, small, mundane, lit by fluorescent lights that were never designed to illuminate anything that mattered. 3 days in the laundry room. That's where Margaret Walsh discovered what rock bottom actually smelled like: bleach and regret, detergent powder, and the specific sourness of scrubs that had absorbed 3 years of a mission nobody would ever acknowledge. She folded them the way she'd been trained. Precise creases. Military corners. The muscle memory of someone who'd once folded the flag of a fallen field surgeon, her best friend, her sister in all but blood, while mortars fell outside a Kandahar surgical tent and 18-year-old Marines screamed for their mothers. That flag sat at home now, framed in her apartment, the fabric the color of dried blood under fluorescent light. These scrubs would join it. Evidence of a life that had never actually existed on any official record. The hospital had been her cover for 1,095 days. 3 years of pushing a medication cart with the shuffle of someone twice her age, of letting Dr. Pierce call her incompetent, of absorbing every casual cruelty from staff who believed her to be exactly what she appeared, forgettable. Invisible. Safe to ignore. The scrubs hit the folding table with a soft thud of surrender. 1, 2, 3. Each crease deliberate. Each fold a small death of the Margaret Walsh that St. Michael's Hospital had known. By the time she finished, her hands were shaking, but her face remained flat. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed their mechanical lullaby, indifferent to the woman standing beneath them who had just buried her third cover identity in as many decades. The folded scrubs went into a paper bag marked with her name in block letters. Walsh, M. Not Margaret. Never Margaret. Just M. Just a nurse. Just a woman who nobody needed to know anything about. She pressed the crease of the final set of sleeve against the edge of the table, and something inside her chest cracked, not visibly, not audibly, but she felt it give way like structural integrity failing under sustained pressure. 3 years of watching Commander Reeves recover. 3 years of ensuring he stayed alive. 3 years of knowing that the moment she revealed herself, every asset in the field would be burned, every contact relocated, every carefully constructed lie dismantled. And now she was being erased anyway. Fired. Blacklisted. Destroyed not by her own agency but by a man in a white coat who was terrified of what her accurate charting would cost him. She didn't cry. The tears that pressed against the back of her eyes stayed there, held behind a dam built from discipline and survival instinct. Crying was a luxury. Crying was an admission that what she'd sacrificed actually mattered. She'd learned in Kandahar that tears were a weakness enemies exploited. The scar tissue on her forearms, thin white lines from shrapnel and field surgery, didn't hurt anymore, but they tightened when she was stressed, and right now they felt like they were contracting, pulling her skin taut, reminding her what pain actually was compared to this. The walk to Dr. Pierce's office took 40 seconds. She knew this because she'd timed it during her first week here, the way operators always map escape routes and identify choke points. The hallway smelled like industrial cleaner and the particular staleness of a building where sick people were processed. Her shoes made no sound on the linoleum. She'd learned long ago how to walk so her footfalls didn't register. The world preferred not to hear from women like her anyway. Pierce's office door was open. Of course it was. He wanted her to see him sitting at his desk, the position of power itself a kind of violence. His nameplate caught the light, Dr. William Pierce, Medical Director. 14 letters. She'd counted them once during a particularly grueling 2-hour assessment meeting where he'd asked her to explain the same patient vital signs 4 times, each time pretending not to hear her answers. "Ah, Margaret," he said, not looking up from his computer. "Your final check will be mailed. Don't contact any staff members. Hospital policy forbids severance coordination." He turned a piece of paper toward her. Exit agreement. Non-disparagement clause. Confidentiality waiver. The architecture of institutional erasure, written in 12-point Times New Roman. She signed it. Her signature was small and precise, nothing like the aggressive slash of her real signature, the one that appeared on security clearances and classified memoranda. That signature didn't belong to someone named Margaret Walsh, geriatric nurse. That signature belonged to someone else entirely. She didn't say goodbye. Didn't ask questions. Didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her react. The silence between them was so thick it had weight. She turned toward the door and that's when she heard it, the squeak of transport wheels in the hallway outside. The particular rhythm of a gurney being moved carefully, The kind of slow, careful movement you only made when a patient was awake and aware. Her body registered what her brain was still processing. She knew that rhythm. She'd established that rhythm when she was the one pushing the transport, the one ensuring every micro-movement wouldn't jostle the fresh surgical site. Commander James Reeves. Awake. For the first time in 72 hours, the man she'd been tasked to protect had opened his eyes. She stepped into the doorway without deciding to. The transport was passing. The ICU nurse pushing it was checking monitors, focused on the numbers, not on the hallway traffic. And then Reeves turned his head, a small movement, still restricted by pain, still limited by the freshly healed thoracotomy site, and his eyes found her face. Just for a moment. Just long enough for his lips to move around a single word, a word spoken so quietly it should have been inaudible but which somehow traveled the entire 10 feet between them with the force of a command. Valkyrie. The world compressed. Time did something impossible. Margaret felt the grid of fluorescent lights above her, the cold tile beneath her shoes, the recycled hospital air entering her lungs, and for the first time in 3 years, something inside her official cover began to crack open. A man in a Navy uniform materialized from behind the transport. Not medical staff. Not a family member. The posture was wrong. The way he held himself was wrong. The way his eyes moved across the hallway, assessing angles and sight lines, that was wrong. That was military. That was the kind of training you only received from people who assumed you might need to fight your way out of a building in a foreign country. Captain Margaret Walsh, the man said, stepping forward. His voice carried authority that didn't come from any hospital hierarchy. He was reading from a document, a citation, formal words spoken with a weight of institutional power behind them. Defense Intelligence Agency. For actions under fire in Kandahar where she. The words continued. Surgical competence under mortar attack. 16 lives saved in a 70-minute window. Protocol violations that were necessary because protocol was written by people who'd never had to decide which patient got oxygen when supplies ran out. The citation read like an indictment of everything Margaret had been forced to hide. Dr. Pierce stood up. The chair scraped backward and his face, the confident, arrogant face of a man who'd spent his entire career operating in the assumption that he was the smartest person in every room, went absolutely white. He tried to speak. This is hospital property. She has no authorization. The Marine Brigadier General who entered didn't acknowledge him. She rendered a crisp salute to Margaret, hand to temple, the kind of salute you gave to soldiers who'd seen combat. Her eyes passed over the medals that Margaret had worn in combat zones and never worn here, never allowed to exist on her chest in this building where they mattered more than her nursing credentials. The general's salute was acknowledgement. It was apology. It was the entire weight of institutional recognition of a sacrifice that had never been permitted to be visible. 2 Pentagon officials stood on either side of Dr. Pierce. They weren't medical staff. The way they held themselves was the way people held themselves when they were accustomed to making decisions about other people's lives and liberty. One of them spoke very quietly to Pierce. Dr. William Pierce. Your operational code name for the purposes of this investigation is a subject. You will step into the hallway now. It wasn't a request. The formal military language made that clear. Pierce's mouth opened and closed. He'd built his power in this hospital the way parasites always did, carefully, incrementally, through the exploitation of systems designed to protect administrative authority. Now he was encountering a system designed to dismantle people like him. The hierarchies he'd mastered were suddenly irrelevant. The institutional protection he'd cultivated was insufficient. He moved into the hallway with the slow, confused movement of a man who'd miscalculated everything. Behind him came the federal agents. Not hospital security. Actual law enforcement. Their jackets bore the letters FBI embroidered across the back in letters you couldn't ignore. One of them was carrying a laptop. Another was carrying file boxes marked evidence with federal seals. The hallway filled with the bureaucratic machinery of investigation, the sound of proper footfalls, of competence exercised without mercy. They walked past the nursing station where Laura stood, her face draining of color. They walked past the respiratory therapist who'd given a statement against Margaret. They walked past every staff member who'd shunned her in the break room, every person who'd believed that Dr. Pierce's version of events was the truth. The laptop showed financial records. Fraudulent Medicare claims filed over 18 months. $2.3 million in billing for procedures that never happened, for patient complications that were invented to justify escalations that were performed to generate more charges. The meticulous charting that Margaret had kept, the accurate documentation that showed what treatments were actually administered versus what was billed, that charting was now a prosecution roadmap. Every discrepancy. Every inflated complication. Every unnecessary escalation. It was all there, written in Margaret's careful hand, in her precise medical terminology, the work of someone trained to document truth in environments where truth was the only thing that could protect you. The agents walked Pierce toward the elevators. Nobody spoke. They didn't need to. The silence was the sound of someone's career ending in real time. 6 months later, he would be teaching CPR to board students at a community college, his hand shaking slightly as he demonstrated chest compressions on a plastic dummy, knowing that somewhere across town, Captain Margaret Walsh was being reinstated to her full position, her nursing license cleared of all fraudulent charges, her service record officially acknowledged. But that was the future. Right now, Margaret stood in the doorway of Dr. Pierce's empty office and felt the weight of 3 years of invisibility lift like physical pressure releasing. Commander Reeves was still awake on the transport. The Marine Brigadier General was still standing at attention. The General's presence, the official sanction, the formal recognition, it was the first moment in 3 years that Margaret's actual identity had existed in this building. The first moment that what she'd sacrificed was permitted to be real. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. Sometimes the person nobody notices is the person holding everything together. And sometimes a mission takes 3 years to complete, but the patient ones always win. If you haven't already, subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the real stories of hidden heroes, the people carrying sacrifices nobody sees, the warriors who protect our nation and then return to ordinary places where their actual work remains classified forever. Like this video if Margaret's story moved you. Comment below, have you ever been underestimated by someone who had no idea what you were actually capable of? Your story matters too.